Okay, welcome back to the Rogue Trader podcast with me, Nick Leeson. Today, I'm joined by a really exciting guest, Tom Hardin. We've suffered some similar types of situations over the last number of years. There are distinct differences as well, which we'll hopefully explore. Tom has a name that's attributed to him as well, which is Tipper X. So mine is the Rogue Trader. We'll ask him how he feels about that, and so many years on, how it still feels to be associated with that name. But we'll get into this straight away. Tom, thank you very much for joining me today. I think your story is fascinating. The guests or the viewers will love to hear it. But welcome.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for having me on today. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. So could we start? I suppose the easiest way is for you just to give us a short account of your story and the things that happened. I'm sure some people will know it, but they're not going to know it as well as you. And hopefully we can start talking about some of the things that happened from that.
Sure. Yeah. Just the brief story. So my background, kind of similar, I think, Nick, working class family. I'm from the state of Georgia in the southern U.S. Got into a prestigious college, sort of an overachiever through grade school and high school, University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School of Business, prestigious school. Got into working in the hedge fund business. So this is around the early 2000s, right around the tech boom and bust back then. Yeah. And I love picking stocks, Nick. I was an analyst by sort of my personality was that way, analyzing businesses and what are the best stocks to own, what are the best stocks to short. I love working in hedge funds because not only were you betting on the best companies, you could bet against the worst companies. So one trade is an example that I never saw really to fruition, which we'll talk about for reasons later, was when Google went public in 2004. I studied it for a year and I thought, you know what? There's 7 Yellow Pages companies in the world that are publicly traded and they're going to go out of business. And Nick, that one trade that had I been long Google, short Yellow Pages, I wouldn't have to do anything else that we're going to talk about. So I loved that, analyzing businesses, looking out, longer term, not a short-term trader. But I also knew around the mid 2000s that hedge funds were rapidly trading on called material non-public information, inside information. Yeah. And, this was set up where hedge funds would hire analysts from technology companies in Silicon Valley just so they could call back to their old contacts at the company. And 2 events that they really traded around the market were earnings announcements. So if you have the company's, earnings announcement in hand before anybody knows about it, you can be long or short based on how that compared to Wall Street's analyst expectations. Yep. And also M&A. If you knew a company was going to be taken over before anybody else, obviously that's illegal. And it got to the point where there would be merger Mondays happening, and every Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, you'd see those call options just blasting off. So somebody knew about this. At one point in the mid 2000s, it got to where 60% of stocks before they were acquired had these unexplained spikes in their share prices. So this is going on. I don't feel at this point I ever have to cross that proverbial line. I'm doing quite well with my longer term ideas, but one pivotal moment we can talk about it is in my second and final hedge fund. I'm a junior analyst, 28 years old, so not much older than you. We're both in our 20s. I get this position. It's prestigious. We're within the Tiger Management umbrella, so we're a small fund seeded by a very well-known hedge fund. Great place to be. We lost money in the first quarter, only a drawdown, not realized. My boss panicked, came into my office and said, Tom, I know we're investing longer term. We just lost money in the first quarter. We have to start looking for shorter term opportunities to make money every month.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of things that strike me there, Tom. When we were a similar age, I was 28 when I started a prison sentence, just about 28. So success was really important for me, as I think it probably was for you as well around that sort of time. Crossing the line as well. We knew what was right and wrong. We both come from, good families, and that distinction is very clear and obvious. And I'm sure that many times, I think one of the differences, and I was talking to this with somebody the other day, a lot of the stuff that you learned was on the job as opposed to being, with so many different working materials that were ingrained in the firm. I was taught by somebody else how to trade futures, how to reconcile bank accounts, how to do whatever else I was doing within the organization. There was no great training programs. It may have been very different for you, but that was certainly the case at Barings at that time.
Yeah, and there's similarities. I was driven more about the status, my
Yeah,
future status I saw as future hedge fund manager. Not so much how much money would I made, but that status implied that there would be significant wealth attached to that. And that was just something for me that I was really focused on. I'm 28. By 38, I'm going to be a big time hedge fund manager, and kind of whatever it took to get there, was good for me. And I was so focused on this, I think, illicit in group of these other hedge fund analysts who are a little bit older than me were trading on this information. I wasn't part of that in group, and I've kind of underestimated my own insecurities as to not being part of that group and how
mm,
much that meant to me in terms of having status in my industry. So
yeah,
uh, my boss makes our goals very short term. He doesn't have any other sort of controls around that, guardrails. I don't ask any clarifying questions because he knows this is going on too. Are we going to do anything goes? Or are we going to stay within the ethical legal guardrails? I don't ask any questions. In the next 7 months, I received 4 illicit tips from a woman who used to work for a guy named Roger Ratnam, who's the most famous
yeah,
person later arrested, Sri Lankan billionaire, ran Galleon Group. She
yeah,
says everybody's doing it, the classic rationalization. Um, at my company, at my hedge fund, I could buy a stock in our portfolio as long as it was less than 1% of the
yeah,
assets we manage. So we always think about controls in our talks today. So the lax control was that less than 1% position I could put in the portfolio. All 4 tips from her were all 0.9% positions. So I wasn't really thinking about the money I was going to make for my firm. I just knew that these small positions on short-term events would add some alpha every month in kind of a
yeah.
tougher market. And my boss never asked me questions. So that sort of fueled my rationalizations, where he was the closest thing I had to mentors. And I'm curious, I know you talk about not having mentors either. And he looked the other way and not casting dispersions on him, but that kind of fueled my rationalizations, me placing these trades and him not asking any questions.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really striking, and I often use when I'm talking about why I made some of the decisions that I did during that period is, I think as human beings, we're all very conscious of what's going on around us. So if you see something happening or you hear something happening, it becomes more commonplace. And I certainly I get that sort of feeling from you as well. I think in one of the interviews that I listened to you speak earlier, prior to coming on here, you said that the insider trading was rampant, I think was the word that you used. So everybody was doing it. For me, when I look back to my time at Barings, and mine, it wasn't insider trading, it was about concealing losses in an illegal account. Warehousing something in an illegal account wasn't something new. I could say not quite everybody was doing it, but it was fairly obvious when it was happening. I was in one of those back office roles. I knew it was happening. I was putting some of the trades in there that were being warehoused, and they might last there for a day or two. Then they were closed. The loss or the profit was realized, and then people just went on about their daily business. Nobody spoke about it. It was just a function of doing business at that time. And sometimes the client had to be made good. Maybe an order wasn't completely filled. Maybe the price was slightly wrong in terms of what we'd promised to the client. And that warehousing was fairly regular. I've taken it to another degree. I know that during my time, and we'll explore that. And I'm happy for you to throw questions back to me. But you are very influenced, I believe, by what you see and what you hear, and you're seeing a lot of this going on, and it's part of that cycle of rationalization that you talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people sometimes underestimate when they hear our stories or stories like ours that, oh, that would never be me. But I got an A in ethics class at university. So one of my slides maybe one day should have my report card. Hey, I got an A in ethics. And a few years later, I'm crossing these lines because I did
Yeah,
underestimate the culture, what I was seeing. There's a great term called normalization of deviance. which I think
Yeah.
comes back from the 1980s when the Challenger exploded in the US, and the engineers, I think, were overlooking things that they should have caught. But I like that idea where the deviance became normalized, to your point, where I felt everybody was doing it. All these stocks were going up with the call options. And so when sort of the answers to the test, to use a term, fell into my lap, I totally rationalized it. And I kind of felt if my boss had a problem again, he would ask me
He would
about
have
these
said,
trades. Oh, and then we'd go through the morning meeting, looking at our portfolio before the open every morning. He'd just say, "Oh, Tom, it's one of those. Don't tell me how you're doing it." So the term, being willfully blind,
yeah.
played a big part, and it also, for me, further fueled the rationalizations.
Yeah, I think one of the other things when you were starting to talk about this first part of the process, if you like, is that shift to short-termism. That creates a huge. It's easy to say it, but I don't think it really. It really gives color to the way that happens. When you're very bonus focused and you've made a loss in the first month or the first 2 months, and you're being encouraged. Pressure to perform we can talk about in a little bit because it's associated with it, but it's just short-termism does prompt that risk. Probably makes you to look at different situations in a different way and get you to step over that mark because you've been given a clear direction in terms of what you need to achieve over that period. Like for me, I never really felt a massive pressure to perform. The pressure to perform, and you may feel the same way, you may not, was very much internally driven. It was, that drive for that success, which led to that status. Like you, I always thought I was going to be at the top of the organization, making all of the important decisions. And, up until the age of 25 for me, when I moved to Singapore, maybe 28 for you, I'd never really encountered anything that I couldn't cope with. So that's all feeding in as well. So as much success as you're having, everything around you is giving you all the green lights as well. You can do this, you're good at it. There's no hurdle for you getting to the top. And I think that then sort of embodies or increases these sort of status relationships that you're starting to build. You've got and in terms of where you're going to get to within the organization, for me, there was never a limit, until things started going wrong. And then, you've reached your level of, or the level of your own incompetence, if you like, because you've made a bad decision and you're staring down the barrel of a gun, really.
Yeah, I think there was, my whole life overachievement. To your point, there was nothing I couldn't have conquered. Getting into this great business school, getting into the career to be, potentially quite wealthy. There was a balance of pressure to perform. So we just compare ourselves to every other hedge fund
Yeah,
when we're marketing ourselves to investors. The investor would say, "Why would we invest with you two guys when we have this other sort of name brand that we could put money in just to mitigate our career risk?" And it was a good point that we couldn't counter. And so when the goals became short term, when we're talking to these investors every week to try to get a check from them, and they're comparing us to everybody else, some funds who we knew or we suspected at least, we had good intuitions that they were trading on inside information. The confluence of those factors played a massive part. And again, we can all think of ourselves as good people. It would never be us. But when you're in the environment like this and what you see around you is what you see, it's very easy to cross that line. I even told myself I was just taking a flyer. So I
yeah,
don't know if you discuss euphemistic language, but that's a big thing I see where I wasn't saying I'm insider trading. I just said I'm taking a flyer, a small position. And I think looking back, that created some psychological distance between myself and my illicit act. I never said I was insider trading because that would make me feel like I'm a bad person.
yeah,
And I always felt like I was a good person. I could make these 4 illicit trades, but I still went to church, or I'm still faithful to my wife. And we all have this sort of scale in our heads. 99% of my time, I'm doing great things. This 1%,
yeah,
I can rationalize. So I find the psychology always fascinating. I know you do too, just looking
yeah.
back and, what were the factors that led to this?
Yeah. Well, I think, I think one of the other similarities, when it happens, it's just going to be that one time.
Yes.
You're not going to do this again. It's just you've got yourself into a situation or you've got an opportunity. It's probably more of an opportunity in your case, but you're never going to do it again. You don't think that, you know, this is, it's just going to be one time. I'm going to do this. Nobody's going to know anything about it, and I'm never going down that path again. So, you know, there's nothing to worry about. It is just that slight deviation from the norm, if you like, at that particular time. Tell us a little bit more about when that. There's a couple of different things that kind of, I googled Rajanat, and I'll get his name wrong, Rajaratnam, earlier, because I do remember the story from when it broke. I think he went to the same school as you, did he?
Or... Yeah, he was at MBA. He was in the graduate school there at Wharton.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. So do we have anything to blame the school about?
It's a good question. I went back there and spoke a few months ago now, and I had a slide. I wasn't sure if I was going to put it in there, but I had sort of the wall of shame from the school to make a point to the students, and the professor sort of gave me a side eye. So, but I'm making the point, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I was only joking with you. I just googled his name before we came on, and that was the first thing that was the first thing that came out to strike me. What about the? I was just interested as well when I was listening to your story earlier. And we have met a couple of times on the conference circuit as well. You know, the lady that was contacting you from S&P, you know, had she been turned already by the FBI or? Yeah,
so the woman who had worked for Raj in the past, Rumi Khan, had actually been charged with insider trading or some kind of crime, but it was a sealed conviction back in the early 2000s because they were trying to use her to build the case against Rajaratnam around 9/11, but the FBI got diverted after 9/11 to counterterrorism, obviously, and so she was already convicted, a sealed case. And I can tell you, I met her when I was 23 years old, very early in the game at a conference, an investment conference, and the first minute I talked to her, I could tell that she, you know, was just talking about her connections, the information she had. She was very much sort of pumping herself up to be something of an information sort of reservoir. And like if you would have told me, hey, Tom, you're 23, the 5 people that you talk to most, who's going to end your career, which one of them? I could have told you at 23. Like I had that gut feeling that she was always pushing that line. And I wish that I had not continued that relationship, but she lived in Silicon Valley. I lived in New York. I'm covering tech stock. She's going everywhere, getting all the conferences, the meetings. And so that's why I kept that relationship. But I do wonder also, I could see that she was sort of an abrasive personality that probably didn't have any friends. And I think one of my maybe flaws is I like to sort of bring people in through my life who don't seem to have many other friends. That's just the way my demeanor is. And so maybe looking back, I should have had more guardrails, obviously, in terms of who I brought into my inner circle.
But she was working for the FBI at the time.
She was actually. So what happened was when she tipped me on the 4 trades, she was not. And then I read this after the fact in all the cases that they knocked on her door a few months after the 4th tip to me and said, basically, we can't believe you're doing this again. Wow. You know, here's the law you used last time. So that was more maybe psychopathy than just a rationalization.
Okay. So how did so it was just by chance that they finished up with you? I suppose in my, you know, I remember seeing this sometimes when I was in prison in Germany, and these are totally unrelated cases, but you'd see some of the guys in prison, and they'd get all of the court documents that were about to be supplied to them before they went to trial. And you look at, you know, there's a myriad of associations, and you know, there was one guy who was English who happened to be in the same prison as me, and he'd pretty much everybody he'd been dealing with over the previous 6 to 12 months were all police, unbeknownst to him. And so he thought these were all people that were in, you know, the network of crime that he was involved in, but they weren't. And just when I was listening to that earlier, I just wondered whether she was the lead for the FBI into you.
Yes, she was the lead into me. So when they approached her for the second time, you know, who else did you tip besides Rajaratnam? Right. And, you know, as I said, she didn't talk to many people. She said, there's this young guy in New York, 28-year-old guy, Thomas Hardin. And I think they were, you know, Thomas Hardin, who the heck is this? And so she had tipped me on 4 trades, and I had passed that on to a friend at a prop trading firm. And so they were looking at both of those rings, sort of her side with the Rajaratnam ring and the prop trading ring, and they kind of figured out the one in the middle was Thomas Hardin, 28-year-old analyst in New York. So that's how I sort of got found in these cases. Then eventually she had IM'd me. Back in the day, we used AOL IM to communicate. I'm going to be in New York. We have to have lunch in 2008. And she sat very close to me and she said, Tom, what would you say if you were ever asked as to why we made these trades? Tom, this was illegal inside information. So she was wired up. I had no idea. I said, yes, of course this was illegal. I said it so loud, the FBI probably had their ears blasted when I was saying this. So she was the one that rolled on me before they came to me.
Okay, and you had to do some of that later on yourself, because you were then working with the FBI to unearth some of the other cases. So just go on, take us forward from there a little bit in terms of how things happened.
So that was probably June of 2008 when she met with me. I'll never forget the date. It was Tuesday, July 8th, 2008, 6:30 in the morning, leaving my apartment in Manhattan to drop off some dry cleaning before getting a taxi to the office. Step on the sidewalk. This guy behind me in New York City says, "Are you Thomas Covey Hardin?" And if anybody, not only on the street, but says your full middle, first, middle, last name, you're probably in trouble. I turned around, 2 FBI agents. If anybody's seen, American crime shows, the wallet's out, FBI, come sit down with us. We sat down at a fast food restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. He's like, look, we know about your 4 trades. We know, Tom, that you were just down in Georgia visiting your baby nephew, and they knew his name for his baptism last weekend. So they just wanted to prove they knew all this stuff about me. They said, my first thought, Nick, with them in my face was, oh my God, my dad's going to kill me. All I could think about was my dad, because he was, all he could talk about was my success. He doesn't know what a hedge fund is. He just knows I'm doing really well. Wharton, hedge funds. He's going to be crushed. I thought, oh my God, my wife's going to leave me. She had no idea. I didn't tell her about any of these trades. She's going to leave me. And then I thought, oh my God, I might be going to prison. This might impact my career. And the FBI basically said, Tom, you're a small player. They showed me those sort of pictures as you described. Here's what we're building. I didn't see the names. They were whited out. But I saw I was way down at the bottom. They had 2 targets at the top. So I figured one of the targets was Rajaratnam. The FBI said, take our card. If you're ready to help us, we can help you. And I said, guys, should I talk to an attorney? And the FBI said, don't talk to an attorney. So I took their card. I didn't talk to an attorney. They were approaching so many analysts that summer in New York in the same situation. 2 guys, unfortunately, killed themselves that day when the FBI approached them. Maybe they thought their life was over. And, it was pretty dark nights, obviously. I didn't talk to an attorney. Finally called the FBI. I said, this is going on. It's rampant. I haven't talked to an attorney. How do I even help you? And they had lunch with me the next week. They said, let's have lunch. And they pulled out a small piece of metal. And I was so naive, Nick. I'm like, is that a battery for your BlackBerry? Like, no, this is what's called a recording device, a body wire. And the challenge for me was she had already given me up. And my friend I had tipped had also gotten me in a conversation where he gave me up. I didn't even picture him wearing a wire, but he wore a wire to me. So I said, how could I be helpful? They said, Tom, who were the worst actors? So I started giving them names of 48-year-old hedge fund managers in Silicon Valley. I'm now 29 in New York. I had to build relationships with these people. Never talked to an attorney for almost 2 years. Got people in conversations. It's an awkward conversation. If I were to ping you, let's have lunch, and then I'm asking you about a trade you made 3 years ago on inside information, you might think I'm acting odd, which would be, an appropriate idea, because there was no training for this. I eventually got good where I'd ask you a question, there would be silence, and I would stop filling the silence. And then the person would say enough where the FBI could then approach them and work their way up the ladder. But it was a crazy situation. Like, I can talk about my most situation where I felt my life might be in danger, but we can, fill it in before then.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can see how it's such a great book. You can see how it's such a great movie as well. The story that I think we're about to come on to is, when you're approaching one person in particular, and you're going down there trying to work out how you're going to get information out of the guy, and he wants to go for a swim, and you're wired up, and you've got to strip down to a pair of bathing shorts. So he obviously he was obviously very wary of what was going on at that time, and people being people being caught for insider trading. And But yeah, just before we get onto that little bit, I just wanted to touch on the bit because we spoke a little bit off camera before this, just about what your wife was going through, because again, I think there's a distinct similarity for me during that time. Not just my wife, but my my family, my dad, my mother had already passed away, but my brother and sisters were also back at the family home, if you like, and having to deal with this, very sensationalist media, but a massive media glare and attention on me. And, I look back on it now and I see it as quite cowardly, because I was in prison in Germany. I had 4 walls to contend with, incarceration, loss of my freedom and all that sort of stuff. But it was all, it was all very self-contained, and I wasn't dealing with the dramas outside. Now, you had to deal with a lot of those, and you dealt with those the best that you possibly could. But I would imagine by the same metric, your wife had to deal with lots of different things as well. She's got to talk to her friends, her family, etc., etc., and she knows nothing about the situation. I think when you find yourself in a situation like this, and I'm sure you'll attest to it, it's you can't really tell anybody. You try to keep everything to yourself. The FBI have almost become your friends in this situation, I suppose, as you pass through this process. But for me, I never told anybody about what was going on. We'll come on to shame and embarrassment and things like that later on, because I was feeling all of those. This was the complete opposite of what I wanted to happen for my career. I wanted to be successful, and I'm failing, and I'm going to be remembered for my biggest ever failure, and I just couldn't cope with that. And I think whilst I was in prison in Germany, my lawyers would come in for a half an hour a week. Sometimes my ex-wife would be there, and we'd have a very brief conversation, but you were getting all of this information dumped down on you. And sometimes I'd take the newspapers back to the prison cell and I'd put them straight in the bin. You don't want to read them, because it's just making real your failure and compounding it. And, the language that's used in the descriptions of you and what you've done, it's very difficult to take. It's very personal. It's very cutting. And, I can totally understand why the 2 other guys that you mentioned, were driven that far in terms of taking their own lives, because it's very difficult to see a path through this that's gonna see you successful again, that's gonna see you, having a decent life going forward. And it is very, very dark, and I don't think the press do anything to help that. But you were obviously still on the outside and facing some of that yourself. So you dealt with a lot more of it than I did, I think, during my own episode.
It was so Tuesday morning, you're correct. The FBI approached me. Tom, you can only tell your wife. You can't even tell your parents or anybody. And how am I going to tell my wife? So Tuesday morning, she had been working at Lehman Brothers in 2008. So she was going through her own set of issues with the company and coming home, and just all that stress. I thought, oh my God, how is she going to take this? So that was a Tuesday. Wednesday and Thursday, I was having panic attacks, bad sweats. I was just getting up early saying, we've got some positions in Europe I have to go look at. And I was staying late. We have positions in Asia I have to stay for. And so I didn't want to actually have to confront her. Then it's Friday afternoon. The weekend's coming. I'm going to have to talk about this, because she knows something's off with me. We get home, young couple, New York City, how was your week? And I said, let me go first. You got to sit down. Tuesday morning, the FBI approached me. I did it. No, this is not something they're making up. I did do these trades. And she said, can you say that again? It was not what she was expecting. I said it again, and she paused, but it felt like forever. And she said, you know what? You didn't do anything to hurt me. You always told me, Tom, the industry was corrupt, and now you're involved in this. But if the FBI is giving you a chance to clean it up, then you should do it. And there's a stat I saw once that 85% of marriages would end right there, when the spouse is no longer the future hedge fund manager and the future tipper X. So it wasn't easy, obviously, and we could talk about that, of course. But the way that she took it was just a huge relief for me. Not that the shame was gone or the guilt or that type of thing, but the way she took it was, she's the real hero of the story. And I was mentioning earlier, I'm writing a book now about my experience, and I'm actually interviewing her about her experience at the time. And so we had to keep this secret together for about
Yeah.
18 months before
Wow.
it was public. So there was the period between 2008 and 2010 where nobody knew I was Tipper X until that became public in January of 2010, which was a whole nother set of issues for her to have to deal with.
And so from that point, the FBI, they weren't. Had you been arrested, or were you? It was much later you were sentenced, wasn't it? It was 2015, I think you were sentenced.
Right. So I wasn't arrested. I pled guilty in December 2009. My cooperation was starting to come to a close. The FBI had asked me to wear a wire on two friends I had tipped. I drew the line at good friends. So I sort of rationalized I'm going to help them get the worst actors. People sort of have an issue with that sometimes. Tom, you were a rat, you were a snitch. That's not the way I thought about it. I said, hey, I'm in this situation. I know some people who are making millions and millions doing this. I'll help them out. When I got to two friends, I drew the line. I'm not going to take them down for something I did. The FBI said, we're done with you. January 12th, almost 15 years ago, last week, 2010, Tipper X revealed in the front of the Wall Street Journal. So I had my own front page of the newspaper story. That was a Wednesday morning. Monday, my wife had just gone back to work. She was at Lehman had gone under. She was working for a client of Lehman, trying to clean up the deals. She went back to work Monday after maternity leave for 3 months, showing pictures of our baby to her colleagues. On Wednesday, her husband's name is on the front of the Wall Street Journal. I feel so guilty today, not even asking her about that time, how she was dealing with it. The worst I felt actually was I was a stay-at-home dad then, couldn't work. Tipper X is everywhere. I'm holding the 3-month-old. There's phone calls every day. There's reporters showing up at my house in New Jersey. Want to comment, I'm not answering the door. She sees all this stuff. She comes home. She had been so stoic the whole time. Tom, you got us into this. You're going to get us out of it. I couldn't believe it. She grabs the baby, goes in the corner. She just starts bawling and says, I can't believe you did this to us.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to feel lower than that situation, right there.
No, I'd agree. I mean, I think, as much as there's a complete web of lies that you're living on a day-to-day basis when the episode is going on, you're lying to everybody around you, your family, your wife. I think probably one of the advantages, if I can give you one advantage out of the situation, I suppose, is that I didn't have any children at the time. I know you had a young child, but they're going to remember you, the person, as opposed to the stories. And I often get asked to do, on a 20th anniversary of Barings, the collapse of Barings, or the 25th anniversary of the collapse of Barings, I get asked by one of the newspapers to do an article, or maybe do an at-home sort of photo with some of the family. And I think it was only on one of those occasions that my son actually realized who I was, type of thing. Not that it was this massive eye-opening event, but I had to be honest with him about my past and things that had happened. But he was at an age where he could understand that. And the bottom line is, Tom, is that he'll remember you as his dad, first and foremost. The other sort of stuff, I think you're an excellent speaker. You can use that story, as I try to bring life messages to your child as well. And there are ways that you can turn it into a positive. And I'm always, I suppose that's one of the positives. It's a strange positive, but it's one of the positives out at the time. But I agree. I think the reason for my marriage breakdown during that period was obviously the volume of lies that I'd been telling on a daily basis, that that breach of trust, that complete dishonesty, and and I think that's totally valid. So I think your wife has done, she's very stoic, and she's very brave to have worked through that process. It's and I definitely like the idea that you're interviewing her to bring that color to the book as well. Take us through the swimming episode. I'm intrigued by this, because you know, if I think myself, and you know, I wasn't turned by a police force. I was arrested for my wrongdoing, but you know, I'm just intrigued as to how this person who was working as in a fund management firm as an analyst then becomes super sleuth, if you like. You're being wired up, and you're talking to people that you wouldn't normally talk to, but it's you know, just going back one step from there, just before you explain that, and you can probably ask these two together. You know, when you're in that situation, it's fight or flight. You know, and I think in one of the things that I've listened to you before, you just confessed it all straight out. You know, there was no fight in you. It was, you know, the magnitude of the situation completely outweighed anything else that was going on in your head.
Yeah, when the FBI approached me, I started confessing all the trades, and I think they were a little taken aback because usually you would say that wasn't me, that was just rumors. I'm going to talk to my general counsel or talk to a lawyer and get back to you. And you know, I think it's rare just to say, yeah, I did it, and I shouldn't have. And so they were taken aback, and so I start doing this wire wearing thing, and it was a double. I know we sort of had our both of our double lives in a situation. My double life was this sort of wire wearing escapade for 18 months and getting people in these conversations. And one guy high up the FBI's list, I probably got him in 15 face-to-face conversations over the first year. He'd always change the subject. He was definitely on to me. One Sunday afternoon, he gives me a call and says, Tom, we need to have dinner tonight. We need to talk. And this is on a Sunday. That's odd. Call the FBI. They get super excited. They
Yeah.
met me at the train station in New York, in Manhattan, Grand Central, give me the wire. I took the train out to the suburbs, Greenwich, Connecticut. He meets me at the train station and says, Tom, good to see you. I brought swim trunks for you. We're going swimming at my mother's house. So that show, if it's popular, I think Sopranos is popular that summer. All these ideas are going through my head. I played it cool, got into his car, said, let's go swimming. We drive to this old house in Greenwich, Connecticut. He starts disrobing in this room. So he wants to see if it's taped to my chest. It was a small piece of metal in my front pocket. I excused myself, went to the
Okay.
restroom, took the wire out, put it in my jeans, put these swim trunks on. So it's the two of us walking out to this pool. It was so quiet. I saw a shovel against the house, a hole in the ground. I thought, oh my God, is this guy going to try to kill me or something? And I saw he was having some landscaping done. We get into the pool. He keeps pouring it on. He grabs a tennis ball so we can play the awkward game of catch, freaking me out. I just want to go home at this point. He said, Tom, I've been acting kind of weird, which I had. He said that he spoke to an attorney and he has a sort of gotcha question for me that I have to answer truthfully.
Yeah.
I was going to give up my cover. I said, the FBI will understand this when I get back and explain it to them. I said, what do you want to know? And he said, okay, Tom, have you been approached by the SEC? So truthfully, I could say, no, not the SEC. That's the regulator. It was the FBI.
Yeah.
I said, no, not the SEC. He's like, all right, I just had to make sure you weren't wearing a wire. Here's how I did it. Answered all my questions, made all these implicating statements. He was actually never charged, not only criminally or even civilly, which has the lower burden of proof by the SEC, because I think I didn't record that conversation, which is why they didn't charge him.
Right.
And now, up until a few years ago, he was actually still managing money for outside investors. I think now he's a family office, but that was the closest I ever felt to my life in danger. I'm not a good swimmer, and also that situation was frightening.
And how was, so your wife knew you were going out with the taps when that was happening as well?
Yeah.
That must have been really tough for her as well, because you know there is that jeopardy that surrounds that situation every time you're going out like that.
And we didn't know it was a swim. It was just come have dinner with me, and then he popped the
Yeah,
swim trunks as a surprise. So I just said I'm having dinner in Greenwich.
yeah,
I kind of kept it vague for her because I didn't want to worry her. I sort of kept it as vague as I could. Where was I going? Who was I targeting?
yeah. And was it sort of the classic wire taped to your torso, or it was just a tiny little wire that was?
It was just the tiny device. So the FBI said if it ever fell in my front pocket, my cover was supposed to be, oh, there's my extra BlackBerry battery. I'm not sure that I never had to test it. So I think the way the swimming pool guy was picturing it was sort of taped to my chest like a mafia movie. And
Right.
it was not that. It was a small device in my front pocket.
Okay. And so there was, I think in one of the things that I listened to, it said there were 20 people arrested in total.
There was over 80 people arrested, but The tipper X got credit with 20, and when Roger Rotnam was arrested, the first 20 people were arrested October of 2009. In the Wall Street Journal, all the names were out, and in the middle, it wasn't my name; it was somebody they were calling Tipper X. And Nick, I didn't even know I was Tipper X, and I called the FBI. I said, I'm an analyst. I could kind of figure this out. Am I Tipper X? They said, yes, you are. My first question was, is my life in danger? Because these are people of means. They said, no, I think you're fine, but you should talk to an attorney. I talked to an attorney. He couldn't believe. He said, who was your attorney for the last 2 years? I said, you're the first I've even talked to.
It's crazy.
And he's thinking, Tom, like, you're supposed to talk to an attorney the first day. You're not supposed to talk to the FBI. You're supposed to call your attorney. I said, hey, man, it's my first time doing this. This is what they told me.
Yeah, it's your only time doing that. Just on that point, when I was Googling Rajaratnam earlier, there was another case where, and I don't know if this is true, and they don't completely name him within it, but somebody from the prison was later on incarcerated because they were taking bribes from a high net worth individual that was rumored to be Rajaratnam. So he didn't really change his, a leopard didn't change his spots in that regard. He was bribing the guards to give him an easier life in the prison system as well. So look, you're not a whistleblower, and I think you've said before that you wouldn't have been a whistleblower. I think sometimes when I've looked at episodes like this in the past, and talking more about my own, and you can bring in your own experiences as well, because I know you have some. But for me, I don't think I ever thought that I could continue forever. There were certain things that were happening within the organization that were always going to limit how long this could go on for. The bank was a small bank from a capital perspective, but I always thought somebody was going to ask me a difficult question. There were far more controls and systems in place that should have exposed me far sooner than in your situation, which is a number of conversations between people, which you can secrete away to a certain extent. So for me, there was never any challenge. But I think what happened in my case is once you've been doing this for a certain amount of time, and people aren't asking you the difficult questions, and you're able to keep going, and you're still getting money in order to be able to fund the position, you start to become very contemptuous of the people around you. And that in some ways, for me, it gave me more time to try and change the situation. And I know the situations are very different. But were there any controls internally that really should have caught what was happening at that time? I think the way you've explained it so far is you were trading below the limit in terms of how much exposure the firm had to the particular asset or the stock. You weren't putting on huge trades yourself. You were putting on some small trades, but they weren't, I think the amount of money that I've seen mentioned was, a profit of 46,000, something like that over that period. One of the criticisms I often get levied at me, which I think is just, I'm not going to try and rebut it in any way, shape or form. I was taking a salary. I was getting paid bonuses during that period. So it's all part of the remuneration that was ongoing through that period, through my actions. And, I can see the validity of the criticism. But, apart from a few small trades you were taking yourself, there's nothing that immediately stands out as being obvious.
Yeah, and I'd never considered the idea of ever being caught. That might be different with our situations, because I told myself I'm trading so small, I'm taking flyers, the 0.9% positions. I really felt, and again, this is the rationalization, if all these guys are making millions, my 0.9% positions would be like dropping a penny in the Grand Canyon, right? Like who would even know? The fact pattern is, there are 4 well-timed trades around events. Any sort of basic surveillance software, even then, would have caught it. The other opportunity was we were less than 100 million in assets, and we did not have to be registered with the SEC until we got to 100 million. When we got to 100 million, right before all this thing broke down, we had more controls, we had more professional policies and procedures. The ironic thing, Nick, is we actually hired a chief financial officer as we were preparing to register with the SEC, who became our chief compliance officer after the trades happened. So we sort of hired the firefighter after the house burned down, basically. So
Yeah.
there was that opportunity being a small operation. If I was in a big hedge fund at that time, these would have been flagged or around events, but I knew that I wasn't being watched. And again, my boss was just saying, keep doing what you're doing, but don't tell me how you're doing it. I became known as somebody that has what we called edge. There was just sort of, again, in my 20s, kind of having this status now, which I didn't have before, that I was very insecure about not having, all played into it.
Right. And one of the, like the impact on you, obviously you were sentenced, so you're a felon at that stage. I think that's what they call it in the States more so. On one of the things that I was listening to, that means that you can't have a bank account, you can't have a brokerage account, you're not allowed to teach your children at school. Does that still exist to this day, or?
It's so I can't have so I'm still a convicted felon. I haven't tried for a presidential pardon or anything like that.
Okay.
So I can't, we'll see. But I can't have an account at any of the big four banks in the US. So I've been able to find a credit union. But it took, a year or two to figure out where I could have just a checking account. I'm not even talking about a brokerage account,
Right.
just a checking account because of all the money laundering rules. And so one retail banker called me where my wife and I just had personal checking back in the day. And he said, you're on every AML list in the world. And again, there's a theme of sort of naive Tom. What's AML? You said you're a potential
Yeah.
money launderer. So I can have a checking account now for my business and everything in a credit union. I still have had trouble opening a brokerage account. I can have a ETF account at Vanguard for my retirement. So to be honest, I'd rather not be picking. I miss the intellectual stimulation of the markets, and
Yeah.
I like following what you do today. But I miss it, but also I probably shouldn't be back trying to pick stocks. Just ETFs have actually worked out fine. So I'm 90% sort of ETFs, and I am 10% Bitcoin. So that's something that I haven't had an issue. I don't want anybody listening to go call Coinbase, but so far I've been able to have about 10% Bitcoin, 90% ETFs, not investment advice, and I just rebalance
Yeah.
every year. So I'm able to get around it, but it took a while to figure out how I could just have a retirement, set up.
And the one that I find most cruel is that you weren't allowed to coach your kids at school.
Oh, yes.
And is
Yeah.
that still
So
active, I suppose?
it actually, thank you for asking, because years ago, my 15-year-old was 6 and she wanted to play, we call it soccer football here, and she's
Yeah.
shy. Could you coach me? And I went to fill out the paperwork to be a coach, and there's the question, do you have a felony? I said, I'll get to the straight of this. I'm gonna confess, obviously, to the commissioner. He said, hey, I know it's nonviolent. It came up, we have insurance with the league, and at the time, felons can't coach kids.
Right.
So I thought, how am I going to tell her? That was a tough conversation. She's 6. Just last year, my younger daughter plays basketball. None of the other dads wanted to coach this year in 7th grade. She's 13. I said, I'll coach, but I told my wife, this is going to come up again. I talked to the commissioner in the league this time, and he basically said, I've had people do much worse to be coaches. You're fine, Tom. So now I know nothing about basketball, thank God for YouTube, but I can actually coach her. So at least these next couple of years, I'll have that experience.
No, that's great, because I know you've already said you're interviewing your wife, but I've shared a stage with some of the guys that were potentially facing jail time over the LIBOR rate scandal here in the UK, and one of them in particular was acquitted, and he was acquitted based on some of the voice recordings that they'd taken at the time. The voice recordings were very different when played back as to how they were when you just viewed the transcript. There was more context applied to it, but he was front page news. He was arrested. He was marched out to police cars, and his kids were all watching. And he still gets very tearful when he talks about the episode. And you're not going to go into the rights and wrongs of the LIBOR rate fixing scandal with you, but I think one of his kids wrote when he was writing his entrance letter to the university, he wrote, the date that his dad was arrested, whatever the date was the day that his life changed. And he was of an age to have to experience it. And I just think there's a lot kinder ways that these things can be done than maybe some of the ways that we do it here in the UK, for instance. So I just want to start to round up here, Tom, I suppose. I mean, just advice for viewers. I know that you talk extensively around the world now. You do a lot of compliance and ethics work, which I know is always very, very well received. But just what sort of personal advice do you have? I think, and I'll give you an intro into this, but the one that probably has most meaning for me is I always think that, the simplest things are the best. Always ask for help and advice. You're surrounded by people that can help you. Doesn't matter what industry you're in, what the problem is that you're facing in your life. Somebody close to you has experienced something similar, and they've made the right choices. They've taken the right path, and they've moved forward from there. I was 25 years old when this started to happen. I was 28 by the time I was starting my prison sentence. I had a very spectacular fall from grace, and I saw asking for help and advice as a sign of weakness, and I really should have seen it as a sign of trying to do things correctly. But something from yourself.
Yeah, so I think the perils of making a decision in isolation. So this idea of isolated decision making, I always tell people, if you ever feel you have to make a decision in isolation, then you're going to probably catch yourself before that slippery slope. We mentioned it a little bit with mentors in my 20s, the same. I didn't have any mentors. I think if I had sought somebody maybe 10 years older who was in the position I wanted to be in, or maybe somebody outside the industry, and said, hey, I just got this tip from this woman. Everybody's doing it. I'm thinking about taking a flyer. The right mentor would have slapped me around. There's that slide. I sometimes use this where it's the iceberg underwater, where here's that reward, Tom, the $46,000 you mentioned, and here's that risk in your career and your life that you're not seeing.
Yeah.
It would have been very hard for me to override, I think, my mentor telling me I'd never do it because I'd be letting them down, when in my head it was very easy to override myself. I'm still a good guy, I go to church, faithful husband, I can do these 4 trades. And also, if you're in these situations, you were saying, ask clarifying questions, get outside your own head, kind of reframe the issue. What I try to do in my workshops today is kind of muscle memory. I'll say to the client, in the prep call, here's my story, but where are you seeing rationalizations in the business today? And let's work those in. Let's actually get the reps in. Sometimes I'll do what's called a speak up workshop, where the senior manager actually presents a new product or new initiative that they're pursuing. And we divide the group up into 3 different pockets. One group is your competition, one group's your biggest customer, and one group's your young people. And they all have to ask two challenging questions to actually get the muscle memory and the reps of speaking up. So much today, and I'm sure you see this too, is they tell us to tell people to speak up, but nobody wants to speak up because they never hear back. There's just no sense of justice in the organization.
Yeah.
So those are just a few things that we could go on and on about for hours, but just what I see today in terms of, also one more thing, like companies have to ask questions that they may not want to know the answers to.
Yeah.
This has kind of been talked about a lot for years since the crisis, but the times of the bad apple in the barrel, we're always sort of chasing the next bad apple. Here's another control. We're not actually looking about the conduct, or sort of the conduct eats the culture for breakfast. The conduct eats the control for breakfast. And so I think, again, we can't say this enough. Look at the culture, look at the sort of the barrel. What kind of behaviors is that letting fester in the organization? I think today there's sometimes not really a root cause analysis done because companies don't want to know about the problems they're having as to why they're having them. So just something for people listening to continue to think about and talk about.
Yeah, I think just building on that, I remember being at an event many years ago in the Barbican in the city of London, and somebody walked over to me, and it was a treasury function. So he was a senior treasurer in one of the big banks in the UK. And he said, I'm really worried about, so this was kind of off the cuff. And he said, can I ask a piece of advice? And I'm like, I'm not sure I'm the best one to be giving advice, but he said, no, look, I'll give you the situation. I've got an email in my outbox ready to send. I'm really concerned about something that's happening in the organization, and I want to send it to the CEO, and I want to out the behavior. I want to make everybody aware of it, but I'm just worried about what sort of impact it'll have on me and my job and in the workplace and my relationships with other people. And he said, I just can't get to the stage where I press the send button. And I said, look, you have to send it, because, if my story, and I suppose your story embellishes and magnifies this statement as well, you can get another job. It's far more difficult to get another reputation. And I think we've both, struggled with that over the years. I think we've both come through that situation and have managed to build a new career and have new success in different ways. I think both of the situations forced us to take our foot off the accelerator, look at ourselves, do some work with ourselves, our relationships, etc., with many different people. But yeah, look, it's very difficult to build another reputation, and if people can't see through that, and sometimes they take some really bad, even worse decisions than we did during the period that we were the bad actors. I think the other thing that resonates for me, Tom, just in terms of some of the words that we've spoken about, and status is one of them. I wouldn't have described myself as being very mature from a business perspective. That you're still learning, still being shaped in terms of the way that you approach the business that you're performing. But I wrote a book with a psychologist in the UK who had a particular approach to the way that you think about things. And I talk a lot about success. You used the word status earlier. But he ends the first chapter, which is me talking about success, him talking about status, with the phrase that says, when an immature person has status, they will do anything, absolutely anything, to protect it. And that for a lot of reasons kind of resonates with me, and it embodies a lot of what happened to me during that period. You've got all these status relationships. They're too important to you. You're getting to the top of the organization, and you're trying to keep them all happy at the same time, trying to please everybody. Even the story when you talk about the first broker that you mentioned, the first stock to, I think it was Kronos. There's a pleasing element to that as well, and a status relationship that may not be as obvious at the beginning, but they become too important to you, and you're not challenging yourself as much as you possibly should be at that particular time. But I think for me, as it is with you, you still deal with the shame. I don't think you can ever completely do away with that. I'm always dealing with the embarrassment. But I think the thing that I take away from it these days, and it's 30 years later on for me now. I was going to say 29, but it's 30 years next month. I think you've worked so much on yourself that you have to. I don't think my behaviors or my conduct has changed massively. Definitely there are tweaks in some of that, but I think I'm the sum of all my experiences, and I think as negative as some of them they are, you can turn them in a positive direction. I think you've done that as well, Tom.
Yeah, no, thank you. Just two things you said there earlier on reputation. I speak a lot at universities today to students, and I sort of challenge them to think about reputation as what people think you are, and sort of character as what you are. And the closer that you can close that gap, that's your integrity. So the closer you are to what people think you are, you have bigger integrity. So it's just an idea I'm playing around with now in some of my talks. And you mentioned shame and guilt. For me, when I even started sharing the story years ago, I was dealing with a lot of shame, and just to define that for people is, guilt is I did a bad thing. I'm going to continue to talk about it. Sort of my Catholic guilt, my penance is that. but shame is I did a bad thing and I'm a terrible person. I feel like I've got past that now. For years I did not. And one of my first speaking events in New York, the event planner said the audience does not feel you're okay, and we want the audience to feel the speaker's okay. I'm like, I'm sorry, and she said, I think you're going through a lot of shame and guilt. I said, those are the same thing, and she just explained it the way I explained it, and that was an eye-opening moment for me.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but sometimes I'll speak at an event and people come up with their own life situation they can't get past. Maybe it's not the front of the newspaper, but they're dealing with the shame and the guilt. For anybody listening,
Yeah.
you can drop the shame. The shame doesn't help you. The shame doesn't get you anywhere.
Yeah.
But for me, the guilt stays there. It keeps me on this path, and I hope that at the end of the day, whenever that is, that I'm remembered for this and not those 4 trades, in my 20s.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in my case, yeah, I'll probably still be remembered for everything that went on during that period in my 20s. I think it was, it was such a catastrophic event in that regard. There'll always be a part of that. So, for me, as you said, it's about character and yourself. And I think I'm comfortable with that now. It's a long time. You go through a remorseful period, but as you say, with the shame element, you leave it behind and you move on. So look, just to end up here, Tom, and thank you very much for coming on. And, we recommend everybody gets a copy of your book. I'm sure there's going to be a Hollywood movie that's going to come around with this story as well. I'm looking forward to the swimming episode within that, and quite to see what they do.
In touch with you and McGregor, right?
Yeah, well, I did well there. I'm not sure who you're going to get. So I always joke that maybe Danny DeVito looked more like me. He might not have had the height, but I was looked on favourably in that regard. How does the name Tipper X affect you these days, or it's just that's what everybody remembers the story by?
Yeah.
I'm always referred to as. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, and somebody on the internet, which we know can be very, very cruel, described me as a deviant. And I had to think back. That was a phrase that I hadn't seen before. But original rogue trader, disgraced banker. They're the usual ones they throw out at me. I think they would have been more painful years ago. Now it's just kind of water off a duck's back, really.
So I'm actually in the process of filing at the U.S. Patent Office for trademark on Tipper X. So I'm keeping it.
Totally.
Somebody very close to me. Yeah, somebody very close to me in my life feels actually I should not be Tipper X anymore. I should just be Tom Hardin. And I am both, but I think just in the work I'm doing, and I am Tipper X. I'll always be Tipper X, and I guess I'm happy I'm not Tipper Y. I'm not sure what they're doing, but just the FBI actually gave me that name because my hedge fund had an X in the name, so that's what I am. But I am found to trademark that with the book coming out next year. It's important to have that. But I will always be, I think, Tipper X. But again, I know that I think with public failure, and we talked about this a little bit, like you have to own it. People that want to clean up their Google, I'm not sure if you get these, but I get emails all the time from AI bots. We saw something bad about you for whatever sum of money, we'll take it down for you. And I say, no, here's my website, tipperx.com. Don't take it away. But I also think it's important you forgive yourself. Anybody going through public failure, you have to forgive yourself. And for me, that was the hardest part. I'd be curious, for you.
It takes time. I mean, I was in prison in Singapore for nearly 4 years, and I kept a diary. There wasn't anybody that I wanted to talk to. I'm in prison. It was a very young prison population anyway, but for me, I needed an outlet, and there was I needed some way that I could start to deal with some of the things that I'd done and some of the ways that I'd been during that period. And for me, the only way that I did that was by keeping a diary. So I had a very small, probably, I think it was probably an A2 sort of foolscap book, and I could buy one of those a month, and one day would be one page, and I just think about things and obviously I'm locked up for 23 hours a day. There's, apart from 2 cellmates, there's nothing else in the room. Pristine white walls, you sleep on the floor. So your constant companion is your thoughts and the various different avenue that those thoughts are going down. So, you can see how very quickly people become depressed and become manic depressives in that situation. So it was important for me that I stopped that and that I had an outlet to deal with it. And so keeping the diary was one way. And I kept that diary going for, the near 4-year period that I was in Singapore. And, I was released on the 3rd of July, 1999. And the last thing that they made me do was to shred my diaries, because you weren't allowed to keep them. Now, I don't think it had a massive psychological effect on me. Maybe it was another way of shedding some of that as well. That was a previous life. I've dealt with it personally. I've kept that diary. I've looked at things that I did, mistakes and bad decisions that I made during that period, and not just all work related. Some of them were relationship related, and I've kind of worked through that process through the diary. But maybe, all of these years later, 25 years since I left prison, maybe shredding those was a way of leaving that part of it behind. But for me, all of that process was done behind the 4 walls of a prison, rather than with a bit of media glare. And as I said at the beginning, I still view that as slightly cowardly. It wasn't my choice, but it was definitely the easier way to deal with it than people who had to face it front and center. And that's not just family and friends, etc. It's people like Peter Norris, who was the CIO of Bearings, who would have been probably the first port of call. I've apologized to him unreservedly. I haven't seen him a great deal, but I have seen him on a couple of occasions, and that my apology was accepted. But when you see the impact, and I'm sure you're seeing this at the moment as you're talking to your wife and you're interviewing her. When I saw Peter for the first time, all I could focus on was him. And we were doing this program, a radio program called The Reunion, where there were some other people from Bearings, some other people from the city at that time. There was John Gapper, who's a very well-known Financial Times journalist. There was the liquidator, a gentleman by the name of Alan Bloom. And they would have had a lot to do with Peter during that time. So it wasn't just necessarily Peter berating me because he didn't, he's too much of a gentleman to do that. But you could see in the other stories that involved Peter, the pain and the difficulty and the embarrassment that he went through during that time. And none of it, well, not all of it, well, the vast majority of it wasn't self-inflicted. It was all inflicted by me. And I think sometimes, and I'm sure you're experiencing this to a certain extent, that's the far more difficult part. The stories that your wife is telling you, and the situations that she would have found herself. She's a very strong individual, and not only did she survive Lehman, she survived you and everything everything that was going on. Maybe that's too crude a way of putting it, but she's obviously, she's obviously a very, very strong lady and very loyal, which I think is, is extremely important. And I wish you both every success going forward. And as much as you've been Tipper X on the podcast today, you are Tom Hardin, and I thank you very much for your honesty and approach here today, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Nick. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah. So if people need to get a copy of the book, they need to follow Tom on all of his social media, and get ready for the movie. I'm a bit too old to play Tom, so it'll be somebody else.
We'll get you in there, Nick, as an extra.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, some of it, and that's a weird thing. You know, one of my friends from the trading floor is an extra on Rogue Trader.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
wow. Okay.
it's bizarre, but he's of Asian descent, so he fitted in quite well
Singapore.
in
Okay.
one of the trading scenes. But he jokes about it, and he joins me on the podcast from time to time as well. So we're still friends to this day. But every success in the future, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.